do significant technological changes require firms and, I guess, whole industries to significantly change as well? Yeah. Are the changes that we see in technology now, like in social media and communication technology, cloud computing and so on, are they likely to culminate into significant technological change for many companies and many industries? Yeah. Are most companies, and I guess most of you, are you going to change significantly in response to these technological changes? Well, probably not. Well, unless you count dying as a significant change, and there's something to be said for that. And I say that because, well, not because I particularly know any of you, but because, of course, this set of technological changes is unique to this day and age. Technological change itself, of course, isn't. Right? We've seen significant change before. I know, the steam engine comes to mind, or electricity, or telephony, or whatever it is. We've seen significant technological change before, which means that we know quite a lot about what firms do in response to technological change. And quite often the answer is not a lot, and certainly not enough. Particularly, two professors, Mike Tushman from the Harvard Business School and Phil Anderson from INSEAD, did a lot of research, indeed, in various industries on how firms respond to technological change. And the way you can imagine it is actually very simple. For a variety of industries, they would always map the top 10 players in an industry and then look again 10 years later, when the industry would have significantly changed, for example, in terms of business models or so. And then they would simply compare which ones made it and which ones not. And what they found was quite surprisingly consistent. Basically, if you compare the top 10s across the years, 7 out of 10 firms don't make it. 7 out of 10 firms completely drop off the map, and when you look 10 years later at the top 10, 7 out of 10 are completely new firms. Meaning, as we put it, that most change in industries is what we call Darwinian change, rather than Lamarckian change. And Darwinian change is simply old firms dying, new firms with new business models and technologies emerging. Now, of course, it does also mean that 3 out of 10 firms, on average, do make it and do manage to change. But that is the minority of them. What I want to do with my 45 minutes with you is look at that. Why is it apparently so difficult for firms and industries to adapt to technological change? Although usually we see the change and we recognize the need for change. So why is it that most firms don't make it? And in fact, there are 5 things that I want to look at. And 5 rather academic terms. So I will explain all 5 of them. Collective inertia, causal ambiguity, management myopia, self-perpetuating myths, and selection bias. I thought I'd start with a few impressive academic terms to reinforce the message that I am genuinely a professor. But I'll explain most of them in much simpler terms. Logically, starting with the first one. So collective inertia. What do I mean with collective inertia? And the best way to explain what I mean with collective inertia is, I thought, by the way of an experiment done by a guy called Gordon Stevenson. Gordon Stevenson was a biological psychologist in the 1950s. You have to realize the 1950s was the age before ethics committees in universities. So it means that he could do all sorts of, well, let me call it rather interesting experiments that wouldn't be entirely legal nowadays, but interesting as a result of them. And he did a lot of experiments with primates, most often with rhesus monkeys. Although I believe this is not a rhesus monkey, but anyway. In one of those experiments, he took 5 rhesus monkeys and placed them in the cage. In the middle of the cage, on a piece of string, he hung a banana, and underneath the banana he placed a ladder. Now, monkeys being monkeys, he sends the monkeys into the cage, they say, "Go, ladder, banana," they start running towards the ladder, but as soon as the first monkey would even touch the ladder to start climbing it, he would get sprayed with ice-cold water. But not only the monkey touching the ladder would get sprayed with ice-cold water, all monkeys would get sprayed with ice-cold water, because in fact the stairs were hooked up to the sprinkler system in the cage. So anyway, so what happens is, well, first monkey sees, oh, banana, goes to the ladder, oh, they get sprayed with ice-cold water, so they retreat, and then, well, the second monkey thinks, oh, let me give it a try, and oh, they get sprayed with ice-cold water, and after 3 or 4 monkeys, they get the message, you know? There may be a banana, but you'd better not climb up the ladder in this place. So anyway, they sit around the ladder, staring eagerly at the banana. Then Stevenson did the following. He took out the monkey and replaced it with a new one. This monkey looks around a bit and thinks, gosh, ladder, banana. And he starts running towards the ladder. But the other 4 think, oh gosh. So what they do is, before he can even reach the ladder, they chase after him and start beating him up. So this monkey retreats. Oh, gosh, gosh. And a bit later, when he even gets near the ladder, the other 4 jump up and beat him up again. And after a while, this monkey also gets the message. You know, banana or no banana, there's no climbing up the ladder in this place. Now, anyway, then Stevenson thinks, oh, let me take out the second monkey. And he replaces it with a new one. And the monkey being monkey thinks, oh, ladder, banana, starts running towards the ladder. The other monkeys jump up, and interestingly, the first monkey, who had been replaced, and had no experience or knowledge of the ice-cold water spraying, this new monkey, with equal vigor and enthusiasm, joins in with the beating up of the new monkey. Now, then Stevenson takes out a third monkey, replaces it. Oh, the other banana, they jump after him. He takes out a 4th monkey and a 5th monkey, until all the monkeys in the cage have been replaced. None of them have any experience or knowledge of the ice-cold water treatment. In fact, Stevenson had long turned off the sprinkler system, but none of them dare to go even near the ladder. And they just sit around. Now, then Stevenson takes out a monkey, replaces it with a new one. New monkey thinks, oh, ladder, banana, and starts racing towards the ladder. The other 4 jump up, beat them up, and so on. And this monkey stops. And he says, why do you beat me up when I try to reach the banana? And the other 4 go, don't know. But that's the way we do things around here. And in fact, that's how I see many executives, no one in particular, treat change in their industry. Let me give you an example. I am originally from the Netherlands, which I'm told is a coincidence, but so I've been in London Business School 12 years. But before I came here, I worked a bit with PCM. If you don't know, PCM is, and especially was, the largest newspaper production company in the Netherlands. They had all big national titles, bar one. After I came to the UK in 2001, I started working with The Guardian in 2003, so one of the big newspaper companies in the UK. And until then, I had always assumed that newspapers were this big because it was cheaper to print on big sheets of paper. And much to my surprise, I found out I was wrong. It was not cheaper to print on big sheets of paper. In fact, it's slightly more expensive to print big sheets of paper. So I asked them, why do you do it? It's much more practical to have a smaller newspaper. I was reading the newspaper in the tube every morning, you know, it didn't make me particularly popular with others. Or on a windy day outside or whatever it is. I said, why don't you make them smaller? It's even cheaper. And in both companies, they told me the same thing. They said, Freek, customers wouldn't want it. Customers wouldn't want it, why not? Freek, that's the way things are. Quality newspapers are big. That's the way it is. That's how people want it. Now, of course, nowadays we know that wasn't true at all. In fact, in 2005, The Independent, as the first newspaper in the world, halved the size of its newspaper and saw a surge in its circulation, basically saving them because they were going bankrupt. Then The Times followed in the UK, halving the size of their newspaper, saw a surge in their circulation. Then even The Guardian had to say, all right, then we're going to make a smaller newspaper, and saw a surge in circulation. And nowadays we see all sorts of places in the world that newspapers, including in the Netherlands I noticed, newspapers are reducing their size. Yes, we, customers, did want it. So then I thought, let me look into where this practice came from in the first place to print them on these ridiculously large sheets of paper. Because nobody could tell me. I asked why nobody could tell me. So I looked into how did it start? In fact, I had 2 research assistants look into how did it start. And it started at a very precise moment in time, at a very precise place. Namely, in the year 1715, in London, the English government decided to start taxing newspaper companies based on the number of pages that they printed. After which newspaper companies said, oh, we'll just make them this big and as as possible. This tax law was abolished in 1855. But everybody just kept printing these things on these sheets of paper, saying, oh, customers wouldn't want it any other way. Now, that's what I call sort of collective inertia. We have certain habits in industries and practices, how we run processes, how we build customers, how we do things, that can be remarkably consistent across different organizations in the same industry, and we don't quite remember why we do it that way. But yeah, that's how everybody does it, and that's how everybody has always been doing it. Now, these practices at some point in time may have come into existence for all the right reasons, but that doesn't mean they're still the right way of doing things. But we just persist with them like a bunch of monkeys in a cage saying, well, that's how we do them. The world changes due to technology, so sometimes you need to reconsider your practices, processes, and even products. Now let me try and give you an example of something where I think might still be such a case of collective inertia. But I should say I'm absolutely convinced, well, because I've been doing research on it for a long time, is that absolutely every industry has practices like that. Practices which may have one day come into existence for the right reasons, or not, but now everybody just does them this way and we don't quite realize why anymore, or that we could do them in different ways. But they're very difficult to spot for a number of reasons. One, because everybody does them, but also because, yeah, if it was easy to spot that they're now an inefficient practice, hey, they would have disappeared already. But let me give you a potential example, because I have learned that when you ask people, they can start off say, well, perhaps this one is not a great practice anymore. And one I thought of, because again, I did some research in this industry, is the medical industry, so pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies, what is marketing for pharmaceutical companies, at least in most countries, as you may know, is something called detailing. And detailing is basically sales reps. You could say someone with a suitcase full of pills and ointments, visiting your doctors in hospitals and GPs and so on, trying to convince them to prescribe the drugs of our company. Now, detailing is a huge practice. I looked up some numbers. These are from the US because that's what I could find. But in US drug companies spend about 1/3 of their revenue on detailing. 1/3 of their revenue for pharmaceutical companies. That is an enormous amount of money, as you can imagine. Just in comparison, drug companies always say, oh, our drugs have to be so expensive because of the huge cost of R&D. Yeah, and at the same point in time, they spend about 14% of their revenue on R&D. So they spend 2.5 times as much on marketing alone. For instance, in 2000, because that's the number I could find, in the US you had 83,000 of these people with a suitcase of pills and ointments visiting doctors, and that's about doubled from 4 years earlier. It's a big practice. But 2 professors from the Columbia Business School, Misek and Jacobson, did research on the effectiveness of detailing. And they found, with a huge study along lots of companies and lots of years, that it takes an average of 3 physical visits by someone with a suitcase of pills and ointments, and giving away 26 free samples to make a doctor prescribe it only once. Once. That's the average. Now, this doesn't sound like a particularly efficient practice to me. So I start doing interviews at 5 different pharmaceutical companies, simply asking them, why do you do it? And in all 5 of them, they told me exactly the same story. They said, yeah, Freek, we're aware of this type of research, questioning the effectiveness of detailing. But we also have our own internal investigations, and these investigations haven't been able to provide conclusive evidence that the practice is not effective. And I think, like, wait, where are we placing the bar here? Our research haven't been able to produce conclusive evidence that it's ineffective. I could do a lot of research like that, you know. In fact, for one of the companies, I said, let me look at that research of yours. And indeed, they had launched 4 new drugs at the same time, 2 with detailing, 2 without. And they say, see, the 2 without detailing are not doing as well as the 2 with detailing. Which was true, by the way. Now, that doesn't mean it makes up for the cost of detailing, but anyway, that was true. So I looked at this and, okay, yeah, it's not a great research project, but how did you actually decide that you were going to do these drugs with detailing and these without? So why didn't you pick this drug to do without detailing, for example? And then this guy said to me, no. Oh, no, we couldn't mess about with that drug. That's supposed to be our next big blockbuster, right? We couldn't risk that one, so we had to do that one with detailing. That one, yeah, that one we could experiment a bit with. So, yeah, you already selected the ones that you thought were going to be successful to do with. What I mean is, it is difficult to set up a genuine research project to provide conclusive evidence that something is not effective. But it doesn't mean it is, of course. I'll elaborate on a few of these things. Which brings me to my second point, which is related to the first one. About why is it apparently so difficult for companies and whole industries to adapt to these obvious technological changes that impact our world. And in fact, this was also triggered by a remark by a CEO who was interviewing about his company. I was interviewing about how he had organized his firm, and then I always asked, why, explain, and I hit on a certain process that I didn't understand his explanation. So I said, sorry, I don't understand it. Can you explain it again? And he said, well, I said, sorry, I still don't get it. It doesn't sound very appropriate. Can you explain to me again? And then he got a bit annoyed with me, which happens more often, but he got a bit annoyed with me, and he said, Freek, look, if in our industry, everybody runs this process in this way. If this wasn't the best way of doing it, I'm sure it would have disappeared by now. And then I thought, that is one that I'm not buying. But I also had difficulty refuting his argument. Because in a way, you could say, well, yeah, if the practice gives you a competitive disadvantage, then firms with that practice will do less well than firms without it, and gradually those firms will disappear and the practice will disappear with it. No, I could understand his logic, but I don't believe it. And I now think I have the answer, why he's wrong. Just because everybody does it, and everybody has always been doing it this way, does not mean it's the best way of doing things. And I found the answer in cultural anthropology. Because cultural anthropology has struggled with the exact same problem. As you may know, cultural anthropology, looking at, say, all sorts of rituals of tribes and so on, anthropologists used to always assume a ritual may seem strange, and you think, gosh, why did they do this strange ritual? But if you really look into it, you can always figure out how it helps the tribe in some way. So practices, because they persist, must be good ones. However, at some point in time, cultural anthropologists had to admit and say, well, certain practices are just stupid. You know, there's no way in which it benefits a tribe. I think of foot binding in ancient China, you know, where they would female feet and they would cripple women, basically. Tattooing practices in Polynesia, where people receiving the tattoo would usually get infected and die. Female circumcision, stupid practices from which you had to say they're just harmful. And the practice which has both received most research as a harmful cultural practice is a ritual among the Fora people in Papua New Guinea in the previous centuries. The Fora people in Papua New Guinea, who still exist, but then were a very large tribe. Really hundreds of villages which could be days apart. And the Fora people had a particular ritual among which consisted of, well, burying their deceased relatives, right? Like many cultures and countries, of course, do. They bury deceased relatives. However, at some point, in one of the villages of the Fora people, say Uncle Ed died. Uncle Ed died. So here his cousins are standing at his funeral of Uncle Ed. And one of them says, gosh, I'm hungry. You want to go? Yeah, so am I. What do you mean? Well, hungry, food. I said, what? You want to eat Uncle Ed? I said, oh, God, oh, all right then. And they ate Uncle Ed. Now, 1 month later, Auntie Mary dies. And say, remember what we did with Uncle Ed? Yeah, and they ate Auntie Mary. In fact, not for long, everybody in the village started eating their deceased relatives rather than burying them. On one of these happy occasions, there was a visitor from a neighboring village. Hospitable as the Fora people are, they said, well, dig in. And this person dig in, and when he went back to his own village and someone died there, he said, do you know what they do in the other village? And they started eating their deceased relatives there as well. In fact, over the course of just a few years, this practice started spreading to all the villages of the Fora people. Till everybody ate their deceased relatives rather than buried them. Now, this had an obvious advantage. They weren't so hungry anymore. And in fact, famine was a real problem among the Fora people. It had a disadvantage as well. The Fora people, not to let any good food go to waste, ate everything of Uncle Ed, including his brain, which meant that gradually, after a number of years, they started to develop a deadly nerve disease, which they refer to as Kuru, which is basically a variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob or mad cow disease. And they started getting ill and dying by the dozens, by the hundreds, by the thousands, until more than half of this very large tribe had died from this disease alone. The only reason why it eventually ended is because, as you may know, in the 1950s, Australia invaded Papua New Guinea, and they put an end to it and said, you can't eat Uncle Ed anymore, you have to start burying them again. And by the way, that's not because the Australians understood that this practice was leading to the disease. Well, they just thought it was gross. So even Australians thought it was gross. Now, anyway. Why am I telling you this story? You may understand now why I'm not scheduled just before lunch. But why am I telling you a story? In fact, that is how we see many management practices operate as well. And you think, well, that may sound a little bit far-fetched. Let me give you an example. And it's just one example. I could give many more. The example I thought I'd give you is of process management systems, or say ISO 9000. Many of you are very familiar with ISO 9000. But also, say, Six Sigma as a process management system, or the total quality management. I don't know much about Lean, and I'd like to keep it that way, but I'm sure it's a variant of a process management system as well. What do process management systems do in one way or another? They say, well, figure out what is the best practice of running all sorts of processes in your firms, document it, make sure everybody follows the best practice, and then we'll see an increase in reliability, quality, efficiency, and those type of things. Well, very good. Mike Tushman from the Harvard Business School, Mary Benner, at the time at the Wharton School, did a lot of research on process management systems, including ISO 9000, across a variety of industries. The first thing they found is, if you genuinely implement one, it works. If you genuinely implement ISO 9000, then you'll see an increase in efficiency and quality and so on. However, they also measured the innovation output of firms, especially the more radical type of innovation. And they noticed that about 5, 7, 8 years after implementing ISO 9000, innovation plummeted. And I'm guessing quite a few of you will have a hunch why that is. Because innovation, by definition, requires you to experiment with things and do things differently, and sometimes simply make an error, right? Because most innovations stem from an error. Hey, the famous one is the yellow Post-it note from 3M, one of the best-selling products. You know, that you rip off and put somewhere else, these yellow Post-it notes. The engineer working on there was trying to make super glue. It wasn't so super. But it turned out, oh, it doesn't dry, and you can take it off, and they made it into something else. Sometimes you have to make some mistakes to come up with innovation. If you genuinely implement ISO 9000 and you say we standardize how everyone runs the process in the very best possible way, yeah, you see an increase in efficiency and quality, but 7 years down the line, you see innovation plummet. Now, that's not bad if your efficiency and quality is what you're after and you're not interested in innovation, but if your strategy is we want to be an innovative company, that's a bit of a problem. Now, why do firms then continue it? Because they looked at firms in industries where innovation is very important. Think of the Fora people. The Fora people could see their troubles. They could see them getting ill and dying by the hundreds and the thousands. But the reason why they didn't stop with the practice is because they couldn't make the mental causal connections and say, ah, that's because 10 years ago we started with that practice of eating Uncle Ed. The same thing is here. Firms see that their innovation output is not enough, but it's very difficult to make the causal connection and say, ah, that's because 8 years ago we implemented that process management system. And therefore we continue with it and we discuss our troubles. Why don't we have enough innovation? In fact, why do we do it in the first place? Well, remember, the Fora people started eating their deceased relatives because in the short run, it gave them an advantage. They weren't so hungry anymore. Well, neither might you be. It solved a problem. The same thing with ISO 9000. In the short run, you'll see a jump in efficiency and quality and actually in your analyst in your stock usually. But the long-term effects that are negative may outweigh those short-term ones. And in fact, which is a nasty property as well, in the meantime, the practice spreads. Eating your deceased relatives is something which is very easy to imitate, and you see that they're not so hungry anymore, and all other tribes start imitating it. Firms see an implementation of ISO 9000, and they see their efficiency and quality and share price go up, and they say, we can do the same. You have herds of consultants helping them implement it. So in the meantime, one of these bad practices can even spread. Brings me to my third point, which I labeled management myopia, which is a bit about this short-term versus long-term consequences. And with myopia, I mean we're always focused on the short-term consequences. That's what we base our decisions on. But very often, long-term consequences are different. I really just finished a large study on IVF clinics in the UK. So in vitro fertilization, fertility clinics. And the British government, a number of years ago, 15 years ago or so, decided that fertility clinics, to please consumers, have to publish their success rate for consumer choice and transparency in the industry and these type of things. So they have to publish their success rate. Well, fortunately, the success rate of a fertility clinic is pretty objective. You know? Pregnant or not is not something we can debate for a long time. So indeed, their success rate is percentage of pregnancies resulting from the treatment. And nowadays you have something they even call the league table. It's now online nowadays, of course, where you can look for every fertility clinic in the UK. There's simply a list with their percentage of success rate next to it. This hugely influences customer choice, as you can imagine. And most clinics are private clinics. Anyone buying this rather expensive treatment is going to go online and look up the percentage, of course. Now, this website gets more than 600,000 hits in a year. Now, this, however, had a rather unexpected consequence. Because what happened is, of course, in this industry, as in many industries, the success rate of your output is quite heavily determined by the quality of the input. Meaning, some women are easier to get pregnant than others. So if a, say, 47-year-old would show up at the fertility clinic with one ovary or so and say, oh, I've been trying for 8 years and it doesn't work, oh, then they think, oh gosh, she's going to mess up our success rate. We'll never get her pregnant. And they find ways of refusing them. Another clinic is more appropriate for you. However, if say, a 23-year-old shows up on the door and say, oh, my boyfriend and I have been trying for 3 months and still not, and say, all right, come in. Yeah? And that's what they do. They start selecting their patients some clinics more than others. And that's what we measured. We measured from all clinics how selective they are, or would they let everyone in, and what is the consequence for the success rate. And we found, as you would expect, the bold line is clinics that let everyone in, also 47-year-olds with one ovary, and the dotted line is the clinics that only let in easy patients. And we see that initially, the ones that only do easy patients have much higher success rates, as you would expect. But then, we measured something that we call a learning curve. Firms in all industries become better with experience. There are studies on that on airplanes, cars, bottles, pizzas, you name it. Firms become better over time. So we plotted here cumulative experience, number of prior patients. And we see indeed that they can become better over time. The dotted line is clinics that only do easy patients improve just a little bit over time. The ones that do a lot of difficult patients learn so much from these difficult patients that their procedures improve so much quicker that after about a year or so, they overtake the clinics that think they do a smart thing and only do easy patients. So after 3 or 4 years, the clinics that do a lot of difficult patients have a much higher success rate than the ones that only do easy patients, although their patients are a lot more difficult. And that's what I mean myopia. These clinics and companies make decisions based on the short-term consequences, because that's what we see and that's what we base our subsequent strategic decisions on. But the long-term consequences can completely be the other way around, for better or for worse. Now, let me elaborate a bit on that, because of course, to do this, as we do in our study, you need a lot of data. You don't just look at the next year's results and eyeball them and say, this is what we do. Huge databases can help us understand these long-term consequences. I could have given all sorts of other examples. There's various studies that show the same thing, short-term versus long-term consequences, where the long-term consequences you can only see with big data and good analysis. For instance, effects of downsizing. Large study on the effect of downsizing, so basically firing people. Of course, that has short-term consequences which are nice for your results. You lower your costs. And again, analysts really love them, so your share price goes up as well. What we knew from this study from these two guys, for instance, that the long-term consequences are often much more negative, outweighing the positive short-term consequences for the average firm in lots of industries. So again, short-term consequences are not necessarily the same one as the long-term ones. So I wrote an article which ended up in the Wall Street Journal, and that many companies after downsizing end up lean and lame instead of lean and mean. Which rang a bell. Anyway, which brings me to my fourth point. Why is it so difficult to spot these inefficient practices and therefore change them? And it's something I call self-perpetuating myths. And I thought the best example I could give is a research project by a colleague of mine at the London Business School, Olaf Sørensen. Well, since then has left for Yale, but at the time of the project he was my colleague at London Business School. He did research on film distributors. So not the ones making films, but the ones putting them in cinemas. And he first of all asked them, what do you need to see in a film so that you're confident that this will be a success at the box office? So show me predictors of success. And these film distributors mentioned the stuff to him that you and I could have come up with. Really predictable things, like well, number of stars on the cast of the film. That's a good predictor of box office success. Or the combined experience of the production team, or the number of previous box office hits this producer has had, and so on. These are all good predictors of whether this film will do well at the cinema. Now, Olaf measured all these things for a whole bunch of films, measured their actual box office success, put them in a statistical model, a regression analysis, regressing that on another, and they thought, yes, they're right. Indeed, films with these characteristics do better at the box office. Now, it could be a rather boring project and say, all right, they know their business. But then Olaf did something clever, I thought. Not rocket science, but clever. Because he measured another thing. He measured how many resources film distributors assigned to films, such as the size of their marketing budget, or which cinemas did they put them in. Some cinemas are more popular than others. Or what time of the year did they schedule them. Christmas is a better time for film than March or so. And he found out the following. He found out film distributors assign a lot more resources, like marketing budget, to films with these characteristics. Logically, right? We think they will do better, therefore we give them more resources. Films that receive more resources do better at the box office. Yeah, if you do more marketing, they do better at the box office. But interestingly, when he corrected his statistical models for these relationships, the original ones completely disappeared. Now, what does this mean? This means that the one and only reason why these films did better at the box office is because they assigned them more resources. They said, oh, these will do better at the box office, therefore we give them a better marketing budget, therefore they indeed do better at the box office. And then they say, oh, they see, I told you so. I really know my business. I could tell beforehand that this one would do well. No, you just made your own belief come true. And that's how it works, of course. There's nothing strange about it. We spend more time and money and other resources on the things that we think will do well, and therefore they will do well. And therefore we think, gosh, I'm good in my business. I knew this beforehand. Which, of course, makes it very difficult to spot that your original beliefs are complete nonsense. And they and you would have been better off had you assigned your resources differently. Now, again, this is nothing restricted to management. We all do this in our daily lives as well, and in all walks of life. I remember a big study by two educational psychologists, for example. The two psychologists went to primary schools on the first day of class of the year. New class, new teacher, and they would ask the teacher at the end of day one, which pupils do you think will do well this year? And the teacher would say, here, John, smart kid, he will do well. Alex, more mentally challenged, no. Margaret, yeah, Margaret will do well, and so on. And they listed from all children the prediction of the teacher, whether they will do well this year or not. Then these two guys came back at various points during the year and measured how much time and attention the teachers gave to the different children. And guess what? The teacher would give a lot more attention to John, who he thought would do well this year and was academically promising, than to Alex, who he thought was more mentally challenged. Margaret, he spent a lot of time. The teachers spent a lot more time and attention to the children who they thought would do well academically. And at the end of the year, those children indeed did better. And then the teacher said, oh gosh, I'm such an experienced teacher. I knew beforehand that they would do well this year. But you have no idea how well Alex would have done if he would have received the equal amount of time and attention. But that's what we do. We base our strategic decisions on our beliefs, therefore we make our own beliefs come true, which reinforces our original beliefs, which may be complete nonsense, as in this case. That brings me to my last point. Underlying many of these things, why it's so difficult to spot them and correct them, is basically a statistical property. So this is not a term that I came up with. You may remember it from your old statistical handbook, called selection bias. And if you don't know what it is, I thought that the best way to explain selection bias was based on an article that I read last year. And an article, it was an interview. It was an interview with a guy called, an actor called Dick Van Dyke. I don't know if you know Dick Van Dyke. Anyway, some of you do. Dick Van Dyke is one of these B celebrities who thinks of himself as an A celebrity. And actually the United Kingdom has about 300,000 of those, but anyway. Dick Van Dyke, in this interview, spoke when once in his youth, he was surfing off the coast, somewhere in the US, very far into open sea, was surfing, then he fell off a surfboard, the surfboard disappeared, there were high waves, he couldn't find it anymore, and he found himself in open sea. And then he said, when I was starting to panic, a porpoise showed up. And the porpoise safely pushed me towards the shore. I don't know if this wonderful story is true. Might be Dick Van Dyke trying to lift himself into a celebrity, I don't know. But I do know, because I read up on it, is that there are actually a lot of cultures and countries all over the world where there exist myths of shipwrecked sailors in open sea being pushed towards the shore by porpoises. In fact, I have started to believe, because you can find these stories in South America and Australia with the Aboriginals and so on, that probably there is some truth to it. Probably there have been shipwrecked sailors who have been safely pushed towards the shore by porpoise. So I read up on this a little bit, on porpoises. Actually, I don't know them. Of course, you see it's a dolphin-like animal. And I read up on them. There's, of course, research on porpoises. And I remember one research project, there was a big bassin with a couple of porpoises, and the biologist would throw a huge, heavy ball into the bassin. And these animals would push this ball around endlessly in all sorts of directions. They're very playful animals. Endlessly, they would push this ball around. And that's the point. These animals don't care where they push this thing. They push it in all sorts of directions. They just like pushing stuff around. Which means that I'm sure there are some sailors in open sea where they go, oh, and they push them towards the shore. But for every sailor safely pushed towards the shore, there are probably 3 sailors who have been pushed into open sea. You know, but the point is, those guys we never hear from. Out frantically trying to reach the shore, everybody, this bloody animal shows up and pushes them back out again. But the only guy we hear from is that says, oh, this wonderful animal, yeah. And that's what we mean with selection bias. We only see a selection of the outcomes, namely the ones that became a success. The ones that didn't become a success, we never hear from. That's a bit of a dangerous property, because we base our decisions on what we see and not what we don't see. And the same is true for many practices and strategies. In fact, I'd say the business world is full of selection bias. To give you just one example. This is an example by a very famous management professor at Stanford, Jim Marsh. Jim Marsh therefore says, because of this property, selection bias, the best performing managers are just idiots. Because what is a good manager? What is a really good decision maker? Well, a good decision maker, as you know, is someone who makes decisions with a high expected return at low risk. Now, that's good, right? High return, low risk. Good decision. So, high return, but with a narrow distribution. Now, what is a really bad manager? What's a really dumb decision maker? Well, the opposite. If you accept low accepted return with high risk. Now, that's a bad decision maker. The interesting bit is this little corner. Because if you just select, say, the top 1% best performing managers, from which distribution is this manager most likely to come? From this one? No, the single best performing manager is more likely to come from the distribution with dumb managers who make stupid decisions with low expected return and high risk and then just get lucky. 99 out of 100 times they don't, but if you only select the top performing one, that's just the idiot that got lucky. And you think this is about far-fetched, but I remember from my old university, I'm sure many schools like yours they had as well, we don't have it at London Business School, investment competitions. You must have had them, you must have seen them, where you give students a budget, a fictional budget of say €1 million or whatever, and you say play the stock market for 3 months, and the ones to come out with the highest profit from your 1 million investment after 3 months, we give them an award and a job at an investment bank or so. This is the best way to make sure you hire an idiot. Sorry. The only way to win a competition like that is to take your entire 1 million budget, do not diversify anything at all, find the most stupid investment around that you can find, place all your money on it, and then just get lucky. Now again, 99 out of 100 times you won't, but if you want to be the one to come out on top, that's the only strategy that will make you come out on top. If you're a good investor and you diversify your portfolio and so on, though you have low risk, you will do better on average, but you won't be the top 1 performer. I do apologize if any of you ever got recruited that way. There are exceptions to the rule, I'm sure. Anyway. So that selection bias We see it in a lot of organizations as well. I thought I'd finish with one example of a company that suffered from selection bias, the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force in the Second World War, so 1943 and so on, so when there were bombing missions in Germany, set up a special project with teams at airports inspecting returning planes. And they had to inspect the returning planes to find where the bullet holes were, because they wanted to find out where the Germans would most likely shoot the planes. And for instance, they would return and say, okay, the bullet holes are mostly over here, so, and then they fortified those parts of the plane. Exactly the wrong thing to do. This practice didn't do any good whatsoever, in fact made things a bit worse. Because those poor kids in Germany who were landing, trying to shoot the planes, they weren't aiming for the middle. They were aiming everywhere. They're just spraying bullets up in the air. So the bullets would end everywhere. The point is, if you would get shot in the tail, they wouldn't make it back home, and they would end up in the North Sea. If they would be hit over here, they would make it home, just home, because that was not a very vital area of the plane. And then these people would say, oh, they shot us again over here, we better fortify this area of the plane. No, it's exactly the other way around. But that's how we base our decisions. We base our decisions based on what we observe, and we don't correct it mentally for selection bias, which often makes us end up doing exactly the wrong things. And one example is, for instance, customer satisfaction surveys. They never cease to amaze me. I very often give these keynote speeches, for instance, just after the presentation of the customer satisfaction survey from this year. So what do? We take our existing database of existing customers and we have a list of questions and we say, where do you think we do well and where do we don't do so well? There's a little bit of a selection here. Namely, if they were customers who thought that we do too poorly here, they wouldn't be our customers anymore, you know? And if they say we do poorly on things that are completely vital to them, they probably wouldn't be your customers anymore. So that's very much like fixing the bullet holes in the planes that do make it home. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But that does show you a bit that implementing these changes won't be easy. We're pretty set in doing things the wrong way. Companies, whole industries, become pretty set in doing things the wrong way. And it is pretty difficult to break. But sometimes it is necessary, of course, when things change in the environment, that you do break some of these habits and really fundamentally rethink them. So here were my academic terms. I hope I'll give you a little bit of insight why it's so apparently so difficult for companies and whole industries to adapt to these necessary changes in their environment. And hopefully the rest of the day people will tell you actually well, how to do it. Okay, hope you feel you learned something, hope you liked it a bit as well.
Great, that's truly outstanding, thanks. Just a minute. So we have a tradition